The magnolia trees lining the drive to Bellwood Plantation were in full bloom on the morning of June 14th, 1858, their white petals already browning at the edges in the brutal South Carolina heat. By noon, the overseer would find the bedroom door locked from the inside. By evening, the county sheriff would be standing in a room that smelled of jasmine perfume and something far worse, staring at a body in a silk nightgown that should not have been there at all. Because Marguerite Bellwood, the mistress of the house, had been seen boarding the morning coach to Charleston by 3 separate witnesses, and the woman decomposing in her bed had been dead for at least a week. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The low country of South Carolina, in the years before the war, was a place of impossible beauty and unspeakable cruelty, where fortunes were built on rice and indigo and the backs of enslaved people, where the air hung thick with humidity and secrets, where the great plantation houses stood like white monuments to wealth and sin. Bellwood was one of the smaller estates, only 2,000 acres, with perhaps 60 souls laboring in its fields, but it had been in the Bellwood family since 1782, built by Marguerite's grandfather with money made in the Charleston slave trade. The main house was Greek Revival, all white columns and wide verandas, positioned on a slight rise to catch whatever breeze might stir off the Ashley River 3 miles distant. Live oaks draped with Spanish moss formed a cathedral arch over the approach, and behind the house stretched the geometric precision of rice fields that had made the family moderately wealthy, though never as rich as the Middletons or the Pringles or the other great Low Country dynasties. Marguerite Dubois Bellwood was 32 years old in the summer of 1858, a widow for 7 months, following the death of her husband Ethan from yellow fever the previous November. She had been born in Charleston to a Huguenot family of modest means, educated at a select academy for young ladies on Meeting Street, and married at 19 to Ethan Bellwood, who was 15 years her senior and eager for a wife who could manage his household and bear his children. The children never came, which was a source of whispered speculation among the neighboring families, and Ethan's temperament, never warm, had grown colder with each passing childless year. Those who knew them both said the marriage was civil, but loveless, that they occupied separate bedrooms, that Ethan spent more time in Charleston at his club than he did at Bellwood, and that Marguerite had developed a reputation for eccentricity, keeping to herself, reading books that were perhaps too philosophical for a woman of her station, and occasionally expressing opinions about the peculiar institution that made her neighbors uncomfortable. After Ethan's death, Marguerite had shocked local society by announcing her intention to manage Bellwood herself rather than selling it or placing it in the hands of a male relative. She had dismissed the overseer her husband had employed, a man named Thaddeus Crowe, who was known for his brutality, and hired in his place a younger man from Virginia named Samuel Pritchard, who came recommended for his more progressive methods. Progressive in the plantation context meant fewer whippings and more incentives, though the system itself remained unchanged. Marguerite had also begun making monthly trips to Charleston, ostensibly to handle business affairs, but rumored to involve meetings with certain abolitionist sympathizers, though nothing had ever been proven. In the rigid social hierarchy of the Low Country, a widow who behaved unconventionally was already suspect, and Marguerite Bellwood was becoming increasingly isolated from her peers. The morning of June 14th began unremarkably. Samuel Pritchard, the overseer, rose before dawn as always and made his rounds of the quarters, checking on the enslaved workers who would soon head to the rice fields for another day of back-breaking labor in water that bred mosquitoes and disease. The house servants were already moving through their duties when Pritchard walked up to the main house around 6 o'clock for his daily consultation with Marguerite about the plantation's operations. This was their routine, established over the 7 months of his employment. She was usually awake early, often already dressed and taking coffee on the veranda, going over the account books or reading correspondence. But on this morning, the veranda was empty. Pritchard found Violet, the house servant who served as Marguerite's personal maid, standing uncertainly at the foot of the main staircase. Violet was a woman of perhaps 40, dignified in bearing despite her bondage, who had served in the Bellwood house since she was a girl. She told Pritchard that she had knocked on the mistress's door at the usual time but received no answer. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. Sometimes Marguerite slept late, particularly if she had been up reading by lamplight, which she often did. Pritchard told Violet to prepare breakfast as usual and wait. He himself headed back to the fields, assuming Marguerite would emerge eventually. The morning wore on. By 9 o'clock, Violet was growing concerned. She knocked again, more forcefully, and called out to Marguerite through the door. Still no response. The door was locked, which was also not unusual. Marguerite had been locking her bedroom door at night since her husband's death, a small assertion of autonomy that had raised eyebrows among those who knew. By 10 o'clock, Violet had summoned Pritchard back to the house. Together, they stood outside the bedroom door on the second floor of the Plantation house, in the wide hallway, with its polished pine floors and portraits of dead Bellwoods staring from the walls. Pritchard knocked firmly and identified himself. Nothing. He tried the handle again, though Violet had already confirmed it was locked. The silence from within was complete, absolute, and somehow wrong in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. It was at this moment that something else emerged, a detail that would later prove crucial. Young Thomas, the stable boy who was perhaps 14 years old, came running up to the house with news. He had just returned from the main road where he had been sent early that morning to deliver a message to a neighboring plantation. On his way back, he had encountered the mail coach heading to Charleston, and he had seen Mrs. Bellwood aboard it, wearing her green traveling dress and a veiled hat, sitting by the window on the left side of the coach. He was certain it was her, he insisted. He had even waved, though she had not waved back, which he attributed to the veil obscuring her vision. This information created a paradox that Samuel Pritchard could not immediately reconcile. If Marguerite Bellwood was on the Charleston coach, why was her bedroom door locked from the inside? If she had left early in the morning, why had she not informed anyone, not even Violet, who managed her wardrobe and travel arrangements? And if she had left, who had locked the door? Pritchard made a decision that would haunt him afterward. He sent Thomas back to the stables to saddle a horse, intending to ride after the coach and confirm whether Marguerite was indeed aboard. But before Thomas could return, another complication emerged. The cook, a woman named Patience who worked in the kitchen house separate from the main building, came to find Pritchard with disturbing news. One of the other house servants, a young woman named Sarah who helped with cleaning, had mentioned something odd to Patience. 3 days earlier, on June 11th, Sarah had been working in the upstairs hallway and had noticed an unusual smell coming from the direction of Marguerite's bedroom. She had not thought much of it at the time, assuming perhaps the mistress had left food in her room or that something had died in the walls, which sometimes happened in these old houses. But the smell had persisted, growing stronger each day, though Sarah had been too frightened to mention it to anyone in authority, fearing she might be blamed for poor housekeeping. This detail changed everything. Samuel Pritchard was a practical man, educated enough to have read medicine before financial circumstances forced him into plantation management, and he understood what a smell of decomposition meant. His mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. He ordered Thomas to fetch Dr. Marcus Waverly from the neighboring Waverly Plantation, 3 miles south along the river road. Then he sent another servant on the fastest horse to summon Sheriff Coleman Breckenridge from the county seat in Dorchester. While they waited, Pritchard made another decision. He could not break down Marguerite's door without authority, and yet the situation demanded immediate action. He went outside and studied the exterior of the house. Marguerite's bedroom was on the second floor, facing east toward the oak alley. There was a balcony, narrow and decorative, with French doors that opened inward. He found a ladder in one of the outbuildings, long enough to reach the balcony, and enlisted the help of 2 of the male house servants to position it. Climbing that ladder in the midday heat, with the cicadas screaming in the trees and sweat running down his back, Pritchard felt a dread he could not name. The French doors were closed, but not latched. He pushed them open and the smell hit him like a physical blow, thick and sweet and utterly unmistakable. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and held it over his nose and mouth as he stepped into the room. The bedroom was dim, the heavy damask curtains drawn against the morning sun. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. The room was furnished in the fashion of wealthy plantation homes, with a large 4-poster bed draped in mosquito netting, a wardrobe of dark mahogany, a dressing table with an oval mirror, several chairs upholstered in needlepoint. Everything was neat, orderly, undisturbed, except for the bed. The mosquito netting was pushed aside. In the bed, beneath a light coverlet despite the heat, lay a body. The face was turned toward the wall, dark hair spread across the pillow. The silk nightgown was cream-colored with lace at the throat and wrists, the kind of garment a wealthy woman would wear. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, the skin discolored, the flesh beginning to collapse. Pritchard had seen enough death, from disease and accident and the casual violence of plantation life, to know this woman had been dead for days, perhaps a week or more. He did not approach more closely. Instead, he moved to the bedroom door and unlocked it from the inside, pulling it open to let fresh air circulate. Violet was standing in the hallway, her face rigid with the effort of maintaining composure. Pritchard told her to keep everyone away, to seal off the second floor, to say nothing to anyone. Then he went back into the room for a more careful examination. The body was positioned as if the woman had died in her sleep, lying on her side, one hand tucked under the pillow. There were no obvious signs of violence, no blood, no disorder. The room itself showed no evidence of struggle. On the bedside table sat a book, a volume of Emerson's essays, with a ribbon marking a place 2/3 through. Next to the book was a glass, empty, but showing residue of what might have been water, or perhaps something else. A candle in a brass holder had burned down completely, the wax pooled around its base. The wardrobe doors were closed. A small writing desk by the window held papers, letters, what appeared to be account books. Pritchard's medical training, limited though it was, suggested several possibilities. Natural death from disease, though the position of the body seemed too peaceful for the final stages of most illnesses. Poisoning, which could produce a relatively peaceful death if the right substance was used. Or something else, something he did not want to contemplate, involving deception and substitution and questions about identity that made his head spin. Dr. Waverley arrived within the hour, a portly man of 60 with mutton-chop whiskers and a perpetually skeptical expression. He examined the body with professional detachment, though even he blanched at the smell and the sight. His preliminary conclusion was that death had occurred approximately 7 to 10 days prior, based on the degree of decomposition in the June heat. The cause was impossible to determine without a more thorough examination, which would require moving the body to a location where such work could be conducted properly. He noted no obvious trauma, no wounds, no signs of strangulation or physical violence. The positioning suggested the woman had died in her sleep, or had been positioned to appear so. Sheriff Breckenridge arrived as the sun was beginning its descent toward evening, riding up the oak alley with 2 deputies in tow. Coleman Breckenridge was a man of 55, a veteran of the Mexican War, with iron-gray hair and the rigid bearing of someone who had spent his life enforcing order in a disorderly world. He was not a subtle man, but he was thorough, and he understood that what had happened at Bellwood Plantation was no ordinary death. The investigation began immediately. Breckenridge interviewed everyone on the plantation who might have relevant information. The story that emerged was fragmentary and contradictory, like trying to assemble a picture from pieces that did not quite fit together. Thomas, the stable boy, was adamant that he had seen Mrs. Bellwood on the morning coach to Charleston. He described her clothing in detail: the green traveling dress with black piping, the veiled hat, the small leather traveling case she carried. He had seen her through the coach window, clear as day, sitting on the left side about halfway back. She had been alone in that section of the coach, though there were other passengers. He could not see her face clearly because of the veil, but he recognized her bearing, her posture, the way she held herself. He had no doubt it was the mistress of Bellwood. But Violet told a different story, or rather the absence of a story. She swore that Marguerite had not left her room the previous evening, or that morning. The green traveling dress was still in the wardrobe, she had checked. All of Marguerite's traveling cases were accounted for, stored in the dressing room, where they were always kept. None of her jewelry appeared to be missing, though Violet admitted she did not have a complete inventory. The nightgown the body wore was one of Marguerite's. She recognized it, one of 3 similar garments that Marguerite owned. The bed linens were the ones that had been on the bed for the past week, unchanged, because Marguerite preferred to handle her own bedroom, allowing the servants in only for major cleaning once weekly. Other servants provided additional fragments. Sarah, the cleaning girl, confirmed the smell she had noticed 3 days earlier. She also mentioned something else, something she had forgotten until questioned directly. On the evening of June 10th, 4 days before the body was discovered, she had been in the upstairs hallway just after sunset when she heard voices from Marguerite's room. 2 voices, both female, one clearly Marguerite's and another she did not recognize. The conversation was too muted to make out words, but the tone seemed urgent, possibly argumentative. This had struck her as odd, because Marguerite rarely received visitors, especially not in her private chambers, and certainly not in the evening without any public knowledge of a guest. The cook, Patience, added another detail. On June 11th, the day after Sarah heard the voices, Marguerite had come to the kitchen house in the morning, which was unusual as she typically summoned Patience to the main house for menu planning. Marguerite had been agitated, Patience remembered, distracted, not her usual composed self. She had asked Patience to prepare a basket of food, enough for 2 people for 1 day, with bread, cheese, cold chicken, fruit, and a bottle of wine. When Patience asked if the mistress was planning a picnic, Marguerite had said something vague about an unexpected guest who preferred privacy. The basket had been prepared and taken up to the main house by Sarah, who left it outside Marguerite's bedroom door, as instructed. Sheriff Breckinridge assembled these pieces with the methodical approach of a man who had investigated murders and disappearances across 20 years of law enforcement. The timeline that emerged was this. On the evening of June 10th, an unknown woman had visited or arrived at Bellwood Plantation and been secretly received by Marguerite in her private chambers. On June 11th, Marguerite had requested food for 2, suggesting the guest had stayed overnight and was being kept hidden from the household. Sometime between June 11th and June 13th, one of the 2 women in that room had died, and by the morning of June 14th, the other had apparently departed on the Charleston coach, leaving behind a locked room and a decomposing corpse. The central question was one of identity. Who was the woman in the bed? Was it Marguerite Bellwood, which would mean the woman on the coach was someone else, an imposter or accomplice? Or was the corpse the mysterious guest, which would mean Marguerite had fled, perhaps guilty of murder, perhaps fleeing from something else? The decomposition made visual identification nearly impossible. Dr. Waverley could confirm the body was that of a woman, approximately 30 to 40 years old, based on bone structure, of medium height and slender build. The hair was dark brown, which matched Marguerite's coloring. But these were common enough characteristics. The nightgown the body wore was definitely Marguerite's, but that proved nothing about the identity of the wearer. Breckinridge made a decision that was, in 1858 South Carolina, both practical and macabre. He ordered the body photographed, using the new daguerreotype technology that had become available even in smaller southern cities. A photographer was summoned from Charleston, arriving the next day with his equipment and chemicals. The resulting images were grim, showing the ravaged features of decomposition, but they would serve as a record. Copies would be distributed to law enforcement and posted publicly in hopes someone might recognize some distinguishing feature. The search of Marguerite's bedroom and personal effects yielded more questions than answers. Her papers were examined in detail. The account books showed Bellwood Plantation was operating at a modest profit, not wealthy but solvent, with no indication of financial desperation that might drive someone to fraud or flight. Her personal correspondence was more revealing in what it suggested about her state of mind and social connections. Among the letters was a series of exchanges with a woman named Catherine Ashford, who lived in Charleston. The letters dated back 3 years to shortly after Marguerite's marriage to Ethan Bellwood. Catherine was apparently a childhood friend from Marguerite's school days, though she had moved north to Philadelphia after marrying a merchant from that city. The letters spoke of literature, philosophy, and occasionally politics, touching on subjects that would have been considered unladylike for the time. Catherine had returned to Charleston 2 years ago after her husband's death, reopening her family's house on Tradd Street, and the correspondence had become more frequent and more intimate in tone. The most recent letter from Catherine, dated May 30th, 1858, spoke of planning a visit to Bellwood in early June. The letter was carefully worded, but suggested a relationship that went beyond conventional friendship. Catherine wrote of longing to see Marguerite again, of feeling isolated in Charleston society, of believing she had found in Marguerite a kindred spirit who understood her true nature. She mentioned planning to travel discreetly, without announcing her visit to their mutual acquaintances, and asked Marguerite to prepare for a guest who needed to escape the suffocating conventions of Charleston's parlors for a few days of genuine companionship. Sheriff Breckinridge was not a worldly man in the modern sense, but he had lived long enough to understand there were relationships between women that polite society did not acknowledge or discuss. Relationships that in the privacy of closed doors might become something more intimate than friendship. The possibility that Marguerite Bellwood and Catherine Ashford shared such a relationship added a new dimension to the mystery, one that involved scandal and secrecy and motives for concealment that might drive people to extreme measures. A deputy was dispatched immediately to Charleston to locate Catherine Ashford and determine her whereabouts on the relevant dates. This would take several days, as Charleston in 1858 was a city of 40,000 people with no efficient means of tracking individuals who did not wish to be found. Meanwhile, the investigation at Bellwood continued. The glass on the bedside table was analyzed by Dr. Waverley as best he could with the limited resources available. He detected a residue that had a bitter scent, possibly indicating the presence of laudanum or another opiate-based medicine, though he could not be certain without more sophisticated testing. If the glass had contained a narcotic in sufficient dose, it could have been used for suicide or murder, inducing a deep sleep from which the victim never woke. The wardrobe was inventoried completely. Here, a significant discovery was made. All of Marguerite's traveling clothes were present, except for one item, a black mourning dress with jet buttons, appropriate for a widow in the first year of bereavement. This dress was missing, as was one of the simpler bonnets, black straw with a modest veil. Violet confirmed these items had been in the wardrobe as recently as June 9th, when she had helped Marguerite put away laundered clothes. Their absence suggested someone had taken them, most likely on June 14th before boarding the Charleston coach. But Thomas had described the woman on the coach as wearing a green traveling dress, not black mourning clothes. This discrepancy remained unexplained until another witness was located. A farmer named Josiah Tucker, who lived along the main road about 2 miles from Bellwood, reported that he had seen a woman walking along the road early on the morning of June 14th, around dawn, before the coach was due to pass. He had been out checking his livestock when he saw her, walking with purpose toward the direction the Charleston coach would come from. She wore black, he was certain, a mourning dress and bonnet, and she carried a small case. He had thought it odd for a woman to be walking alone at that hour, but he had not spoken to her or interfered, assuming she had her reasons. If Tucker's account was true, it meant the woman had walked from Bellwood to the road, a distance of perhaps half a mile down the oak alley, and then another mile and a half to where Tucker saw her. She had been wearing black mourning clothes at that time, which meant she must have changed into the green dress sometime before boarding the coach, or Tucker's identification of the clothing was wrong, or these were two different women. The investigation expanded to include the coach driver and other passengers. The driver, a man named Henry Simmons, who had been driving the Charleston route for a decade, remembered picking up a woman at the posting station where the road from Bellwood connected to the main Charleston highway. She had been wearing green, he was certain, a traveling dress with black trim and a veiled hat. She had purchased a ticket to Charleston and boarded without speaking more than necessary, taking a seat by herself. She kept the veil down throughout the journey, which was not uncommon for ladies traveling alone who did not wish to be bothered by conversation or the curiosity of other passengers. Simmons had delivered her to the Charleston coach station on Meeting Street around midday, and she had disembarked and disappeared into the crowds without any unusual circumstances. Of the other passengers, 2 were located and interviewed. Neither remembered anything distinctive about the woman in green beyond her desire for privacy. One, a merchant traveling on business, recalled she appeared agitated, repeatedly glancing out the window as if watching for something or someone. The other, an elderly woman visiting relatives in Charleston, thought the veiled woman seemed to be making a deliberate effort to avoid notice, keeping her face turned away whenever anyone came near. The trail in Charleston itself proved difficult to follow. The city in 1858 was a labyrinth of narrow streets and crowded thoroughfares, with thousands of residents and visitors moving through it daily. A woman who wished to disappear into its anonymity could do so with relative ease, especially if she had money and planning. Sheriff Breckenridge's deputy searched the obvious places: hotels, boarding houses, the homes of known acquaintances. No one matching the description of Marguerite Bellwood or anyone similar had checked into the major hotels under that name or any obvious variation. The Bellwood House in Charleston, a small townhouse on Broad Street that had belonged to Ethan and was now technically Marguerite's property, stood empty and locked, with no signs of recent occupancy. The search for Catherine Ashford produced results on the 3rd day of the investigation. The deputy located the Ashford House on Trad Street, a 3-story structure built in the Charleston single style, narrow and elegant, with a side piazza facing a garden. The house was occupied, but Catherine Ashford was not there. According to the house servant who answered the door, a free woman of color named Dinah, who served as housekeeper, Miss Catherine had left Charleston on June 8th, saying she planned to visit friends in the country and would return in approximately 2 weeks. She had not specified which friends or where exactly she was going, which Dinah found unusual but not alarming, as Miss Catherine valued her privacy and often made trips without detailed itineraries. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Catherine Ashford had left Charleston on June 8th, announcing a vague country visit. By June 10th, a mysterious woman was in Marguerite Bellwood's bedroom at Bellwood Plantation. By June 14th, one woman was dead and another had fled. The probability that Catherine was the visitor seemed overwhelming, but this raised more questions than it answered. If Catherine had come to visit her friend Marguerite, why the secrecy? And if something had gone wrong during that visit, resulting in death, why had the survivor felt compelled to flee rather than report an accident or illness? Sheriff Breckenridge authorized a more thorough search of Catherine Ashford's Charleston residence. With the cooperation of Dinah, who seemed genuinely concerned about her employer's whereabouts, deputies examined Catherine's personal effects, correspondence, and any clues to her state of mind or intentions. What they found painted a picture of a woman living on the margins of respectability, maintaining a facade of propriety while harboring secrets that could destroy her social position. Catherine was 40 years old, the daughter of a once prominent Charleston merchant family that had declined in fortune over the past generation. Her marriage at 22 to Jeremiah Ashford, a Philadelphia merchant 20 years her senior, had been arranged primarily for financial security. The marriage had been childless and, according to letters found in her desk, profoundly unhappy. Jeremiah Ashford had died in 1856 of a stroke, leaving Catherine a modest inheritance that allowed her to return to Charleston and reopen the family house, but not enough to live lavishly. She existed in a strange social limbo, well-born enough to be received in certain circles, but not wealthy enough to be sought after, a widow without children or close family, increasingly isolated and eccentric in her habits. Among Catherine's papers was a journal, not a daily diary, but a collection of observations, reflections, and philosophical musings written over the past 2 years. The entries were often cryptic, written in a style that suggested the author knew the journal might be read by unfriendly eyes. But certain passages stood out to the investigators as they pieced together the emotional landscape of Catherine's life. One entry from April 1858 read, "How long must one maintain a performance that exhausts the soul? The masks we wear in public become prisons, and the only freedom I have known has been in those rare moments when I can be my truest self, with the one person who understands. Society calls it unnatural, but what is more natural than affinity of spirit? What is more unnatural than the loveless marriages they celebrate while condemning genuine feeling?" Another, from May 1858. She writes that E grows increasingly cold, suspicious, though of what she cannot say. Perhaps he senses what cannot be spoken. I long to offer her refuge, a place where she need not pretend, but the world we inhabit leaves no room for such honesty. We are both prisoners of respectability. The references to E were clearly to Ethan Bellwood, Marguerite's late husband. But these entries predated his death by several months, which meant they referred to the period when Marguerite was still married. The journal suggested a relationship between the two women that had existed for some time, conducted in secret, fraught with the dangers of discovery and social ruin. A later entry, dated June 5, 1858, was more specific and more troubling. "I have made my decision. I will go to her, regardless of the risk." Her last letter spoke of desperation I have never heard from her before. She writes of being watched, of suspicions she cannot name, of feeling trapped at B with no one to trust. "I fear something has happened or will happen. I cannot abandon her to face it alone. If I must risk everything, I will. Better to have lived 1 week truthfully than a lifetime in shadows." This entry suggested Marguerite had reached out to Catherine in some kind of distress, and Catherine had responded by planning the visit that would end in tragedy. But what was Marguerite afraid of? Her husband Ethan had been dead for 7 months by June 1858. Who was watching her? What suspicions did she sense? The investigation shifted focus back to Bellwood Plantation and the circumstances of Marguerite's life in the months after her husband's death. Sheriff Breckinridge began interviewing people beyond the immediate household, including neighbors, business associates, and the former overseer, Thaddeus Crowe, whom Marguerite had dismissed shortly after assuming control of the plantation. Crowe was a hard man, lean and weathered in his mid-40s, who made his living moving from plantation to plantation, offering his services as overseer. He had worked at Bellwood for 3 years under Ethan Bellwood's management, earning a reputation as effective but brutal, the kind of overseer who maintained order through fear and frequent use of the whip. When Marguerite dismissed him in December 1857, barely a month after Ethan's death, she had cited philosophical differences in management style, which everyone understood meant she disapproved of his methods. Crowe had not taken the dismissal well. Interviewed at a tavern in Dorchester, where he was known to spend his afternoons drinking, Crowe spoke freely about Marguerite Bellwood, and none of it was charitable. He called her a fool, a woman playing at being a plantation master without understanding the realities of controlling enslaved labor. He said she had weakened discipline at Bellwood, that the field hands were becoming lazy and insubordinate under Pritchard's softer approach, that the plantation would fail within a year without proper management. He claimed Marguerite had no business sense, that she spent too much time with books and not enough time understanding rice cultivation and market prices. But beyond these expected grievances, Crowe added something more interesting. He said he had seen Marguerite on 2 occasions in Charleston during March 1858, both times in the company of a woman he did not recognize, meeting furtively in locations away from the fashionable districts where plantation society gathered. Once he had seen them entering a boarding house on the less respectable end of King Street, a place where unmarried women and questionable characters resided. He had thought it odd at the time, but had not reported it to anyone, having no real authority or interest in Marguerite's affairs after his dismissal. He implied, with the smirking insinuation of a man who enjoyed suggesting scandal, that perhaps Mrs. Bellwood had interests that explained her husband's coldness and her own childlessness. The deputies pressed him for a description of the woman Marguerite had been meeting. Crowe recalled her as perhaps 35 or 40, dark-haired, well-dressed but not ostentatious, with a bearing that suggested education and refinement. The description could match Catherine Ashford, though it could also match hundreds of other women in Charleston. Another witness provided corroboration of unusual activity around Bellwood in early June. A neighboring planter, Colonel William Thornton, whose property adjoined Bellwood's southern boundary, mentioned that on the evening of June 10th, he had been riding along the property line inspecting drainage ditches when he saw a carriage on the road leading to Bellwood's main house. This struck him as noteworthy, because Marguerite rarely received visitors, and certainly not in the evening without some prior social arrangement that would have been known to the neighborhood. The carriage had been a hired hack from Charleston, he thought, not a private conveyance, and it had been moving quickly despite the rough condition of the road. He had watched it disappear down the oak alley toward the plantation house, then thought no more of it until the news of the mysterious death began circulating. This detail aligned with the theory that Catherine Ashford had traveled from Charleston to Bellwood on June 10th, arriving in the evening, which explained why Sarah, the cleaning girl, had heard 2 female voices in Marguerite's room that night. But why a hired hack rather than the public coach? The answer suggested a desire for privacy, for avoiding the scrutiny that came with traveling on public conveyances where one might be recognized or remembered. The physical evidence from Marguerite's bedroom was examined more carefully for any clues to what had happened in that room between June 10th and June 14th. Dr. Waverley, working with the assistance of a chemist from Charleston, brought in specifically for this purpose, analyzed the residue in the glass more thoroughly. Their conclusion was that the glass had contained a significant quantity of laudanum, the opium-based tincture commonly used for pain relief and sleep aid. The amount suggested by the residue was far more than a therapeutic dose, enough to induce profound unconsciousness and possibly death if the person consuming it was not habituated to the drug. Laudanum was common in plantation households. Most medicine cabinets contained a bottle for treating everything from headaches to menstrual complaints to the aches of aging. Marguerite's medicine cabinet, examined during the initial search, contained a bottle of laudanum that was approximately half full, which proved nothing as it was impossible to know how full it had been before the relevant dates. The question was whether the laudanum had been taken voluntarily, as in suicide, or administered without consent, as in murder. The peaceful position of the body in the bed suggested the victim had lost consciousness while lying down, not collapsed after a struggle. If this was suicide, it implied a deliberate decision to end one's life in the privacy of one's bedroom, taking a fatal dose and lying down to wait for death. If murder, it suggested the victim had been given the drug without knowledge, perhaps mixed with wine or food, and had drifted into unconsciousness before being arranged in the bed. There was another possibility that Dr. Waverley raised, one that was medically unusual, but not impossible. Two women, both distressed, both facing some unbearable situation, might have agreed to a suicide pact, both drinking from the same poisoned cup. In such a scenario, one might have succumbed to the drug while the other, having taken a smaller dose or having a constitution more resistant to opiates, survived. The survivor would then wake to find her companion dead, and in panic or horror might flee rather than face the questions and scandal that would inevitably follow. This theory had the advantage of explaining several puzzling aspects of the case. It explained why the door was locked from the inside, why there were no signs of struggle, why one woman died while the other apparently escaped. It suggested a tragedy born of desperation rather than malice, a dark pact between two women who saw no other way out of whatever trap they perceived themselves to be in. But Sheriff Breckenridge was skeptical. In his experience, suicide pacts were rare, and when they occurred, both parties usually succeeded in dying, or both failed. The scenario where one dies and the other survives and then flees seemed psychologically unlikely. A survivor of such a pact would more likely be found catatonic beside the body, or would have completed the suicide in horror at having survived while their companion died. The calculated escape, the changing of clothes, the boarding of the Charleston coach all suggested a clearer head and more deliberate planning than one would expect from someone who had just attempted suicide and failed. As the investigation approached the end of its first week, the fundamental question remained unanswered. Who was the woman in the bed? The body was too decomposed for certain visual identification. Several people who had known Marguerite Bellwood were brought to view the remains, but none could say with certainty whether it was her or someone else. The clothing and location suggested Marguerite, but the timing and the coach sighting suggested she had escaped. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Violet, Marguerite's personal maid, remembered a distinguishing feature that might allow identification. Marguerite had a small scar on her left shoulder blade, the result of a childhood accident when she had fallen against a fireplace poker. The scar was about 2 inches long, slightly curved, and would be visible on close examination of the body's back. Dr. Waverly conducted this examination with Violet present to identify the scar if it existed. The decomposition had made the skin discolored and partially collapsed, but the scar tissue, being different in texture from normal skin, remained identifiable if one knew what to look for. After careful examination, Dr. Waverly confirmed the presence of a curved scar on the left shoulder blade, approximately 2 inches in length, consistent with Violet's description. This finding suggested, though did not conclusively prove, that the body was indeed Marguerite Bellwood. If so, then the woman who had boarded the Charleston coach was someone else, most likely Catherine Ashford wearing Marguerite's clothing, having left her friend or lover dead in the bedroom and fled to avoid questions about what had happened. But this identification raised new questions, even as it answered others. If Marguerite was the victim, what had killed her? The laudanum suggested poisoning, but was it self-administered or given by Catherine? And if Catherine had killed her, why? What could have happened between the evening of June 10th, when they were behind a locked door together, and June 14th, when Catherine apparently fled, to drive one woman to kill another, or both women to attempt suicide together? The search for Catherine Ashford intensified. Her description was circulated to law enforcement throughout South Carolina and the neighboring states. The ports were watched in case she attempted to flee by ship. Hotels, boarding houses, and private homes where she might seek refuge were investigated. But Catherine, if she was indeed the woman who had fled Bellwood, seemed to have vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Meanwhile, the social implications of the case began to reverberate through low-country society. The suggestion that Marguerite Bellwood and Catherine Ashford had shared a relationship that went beyond acceptable friendship became a subject of whispered scandal in Charleston's parlors and on plantation verandas throughout the region. The journal entries, though not made public, were discussed in vague terms that allowed people to fill in the details with their imaginations and prejudices. Marguerite's reputation, already compromised by her unconventional behavior as a widow managing her own plantation, was posthumously destroyed. The Bellwood family name, respectable for 3 generations, became associated with perversion and possible murder. The enslaved people of Bellwood Plantation, whose testimonies had been limited by the legal and social restrictions of the time, had their own understanding of what had happened, passed in whispers among themselves. They had seen more than the white investigators knew, because servants are always invisible to those they serve, present but not noticed, moving through rooms and overhearing conversations that their masters assume are private. One of the field hands, a man named Isaiah who worked the rice fields but occasionally helped with heavy work around the main house, told Samuel Pritchard something that had not come up in the official investigation. On the afternoon of June 13th, the day before the body was discovered, Isaiah had been repairing a shutter on the main house's 2nd floor, working on a ladder positioned near Marguerite's bedroom window. He had heard voices from inside, not loud but intense, 2 women arguing. He had not understood all the words, but certain phrases had carried through the closed window. "I cannot live with this. You promised. There is no other way. I am so very tired." The voices had eventually quieted, and Isaiah had finished his work and thought no more of it until the body was found. This testimony suggested that on June 13th, 2 living women were in that bedroom, arguing about something grave enough to drive one or both to desperation. It pushed the timeline of death forward, suggesting the fatal events occurred on June 13th, or the night between June 13th and June 14th, not earlier in the week, as the decomposition had initially suggested. But Dr. Waverley remained firm in his assessment that the body had been dead for at least 7 days when discovered on June 14th, which would place death around June 7th or earlier. This contradiction seemed impossible to reconcile until Dr. Waverley reviewed his assessment and considered an alternative explanation. The June heat in the Low Country was intense, accelerating decomposition dramatically, but the bedroom had been kept relatively cool, the windows closed, the curtains drawn, creating an environment that might slow decay. Additionally, if the body had been in the bed undisturbed since death, protected from insects and scavengers by the closed room and the mosquito netting, the decomposition might have progressed differently than a body exposed to more typical conditions. With these factors considered, Dr. Waverley revised his estimate. Death could have occurred as recently as June 12th or 13, perhaps only 1 or 2 days before discovery rather than a week. This brought the timeline back into alignment with Isaiah's testimony and suggested a more compressed sequence of events. Catherine arriving June 10th, the women together for 2 or 3 days, some crisis occurring that led to the argument Isaiah overheard on June 13th, and death following soon after, with the survivor fleeing the next morning. As June turned to July and the investigation entered its 3rd week, Sheriff Breckenridge assembled his conclusions into a working theory of the case, though he knew it remained incomplete without the apprehension of the woman who had fled. His theory went as follows. Catherine Ashford, driven by feelings for Marguerite Bellwood that exceeded the bounds of acceptable female friendship, had come to visit her at Bellwood Plantation in early June, arriving secretly on the evening of June 10th. The 2 women had spent several days together behind the locked door of Marguerite's bedroom, away from the scrutiny of servants and society, engaging in a relationship that both knew was condemned by the moral standards of their world. At some point during this visit, a crisis emerged. Perhaps one of them wanted to continue the relationship openly, to abandon the pretense and live together despite the scandal. Perhaps one wanted to end the relationship entirely. Perhaps external pressures or internal guilt became unbearable to one or both. On June 13th, the crisis reached its peak, as evidenced by the argument Isaiah overheard. One of the women, Most likely Marguerite, given that the body was in her nightgown in her bed, decided that death was preferable to the impossible situation they faced. She took a fatal dose of laudanum. Perhaps with Catherine's knowledge and participation, perhaps without. Catherine, witnessing her friend's death, or finding her already dead, panicked. To flee would mean abandoning the body and facing inevitable questions. To stay would mean explaining an unexplainable situation, revealing a relationship that would destroy both their reputations, facing possible charges of murder or conspiracy to suicide. Catherine made a desperate choice. She would leave the body where it was, locked in the room to delay discovery. She would take Marguerite's identity, wearing her clothing and boarding the coach to Charleston as Mrs. Bellwood, creating the appearance that Marguerite had fled while leaving behind an unidentified body. This would buy time for Catherine to disappear completely before investigators could determine what had actually happened. The plan had nearly worked. If not for the stable boy's eagle eyes recognizing the woman on the coach, if not for the distinctive scar that allowed identification of the body, Catherine might have escaped entirely, and the death might have been attributed to a mysterious intruder or unknown victim. But the investigation had been thorough enough to piece together the basic outlines of what happened, even if the precise details remained murky. The question that haunted Breckenridge was what to do with this understanding. The case involved elements that respectable society preferred not to acknowledge, questions about female relationships that no one wanted to examine too closely. To pursue Catherine Ashford aggressively would mean making public the nature of her relationship with Marguerite, which would harm the reputations of both women's families and potentially expose similar relationships in other households. There was pressure from influential quarters to let the matter quietly fade, to rule Marguerite's death as natural causes or accident, to avoid the scandal of a sensational trial. But Breckenridge was a man who believed in law and order, and someone had died under suspicious circumstances, and another person had fled rather than face questions. Whether the death was murder, assisted suicide, or a suicide pact gone wrong, it demanded justice. He continued the search for Catherine Ashford, even as the case faded from public attention and pressure mounted to close the investigation. In late July, a potential sighting emerged. A woman matching Catherine's description had been seen in Wilmington, North Carolina, boarding a ship bound for New York. The information came third-hand, from a Charleston merchant who had heard from a business associate who had heard from a dock worker, so its reliability was questionable. But it was the first lead in weeks, and Breckenridge followed it, sending telegrams to authorities in New York requesting they watch for Catherine's arrival. New York in 1858 was a city of nearly 1 million people, a place where someone could disappear entirely into the anonymous crowds, where no one asked questions about a woman's past as long as she had money and caused no trouble. If Catherine had made it to New York, the chances of finding her were vanishingly small unless she made some mistake that drew attention. Weeks passed without further developments. The body that had been tentatively identified as Marguerite Bellwood was buried in the family plot beside her husband Ethan. Though the headstone was intentionally vague about the circumstances of death, reading simply, Marguerite Dubois Bellwood, 1826-1858, may she find peace. The plantation itself was placed in the hands of Ethan's distant cousin, a man from Georgia who knew nothing about rice cultivation and quickly sold the property to a neighboring planter who absorbed it into his larger holdings. The enslaved people of Bellwood were dispersed to various buyers, families separated, communities destroyed, their testimonies and memories scattered to the winds. Samuel Pritchard, the overseer, found new employment at a plantation near Georgetown. He carried with him the memory of that June morning when he had climbed the ladder and opened the French doors to discover a horror he still did not fully understand. He would never work for another female plantation owner, he decided. The experiment had ended too darkly. In September 1858, 3 months after the discovery of the body, A letter arrived at Sheriff Breckenridge's office in Dorchester. It bore no return address and had been posted from Richmond, Virginia. Inside was a single page of elegant handwriting on expensive stationery, unsigned, but clearly from someone with education and means. The letter read, "To the authorities investigating the death at Bellwood Plantation, you have drawn conclusions that are both accurate and incomplete. The woman who died did so by her own hand, though not alone in her decision. What you cannot understand, bound as you are by the conventions of your society, is that some forms of love are both genuine and impossible. We lived in a world that offered us no place, no recognition, no future. We were expected to marry men we did not love, to bear children we did not want, to perform a lifetime of pretense for the comfort of others. Some of us cannot sustain such performance forever. Some of us reach a point where the mask becomes unbearable. What happened at Bellwood was not murder, but mercy. Not betrayal, but the final act of devotion between two souls who found in each other the only honest connection they would ever know. The one who survived carries a burden you cannot imagine. She did not flee from justice, but from a world that would judge what it refuses to understand. Let her go. Let them both rest. Some truths are too painful for public consumption." The letter was analyzed, discussed, filed away. It confirmed what Breckenridge had suspected, but could never prove: that the death at Bellwood had been a joint decision, a suicide pact in which one woman died and the other survived to carry the weight of that choice. Whether Catherine Ashford had written the letter or someone else who knew the story, it represented a kind of confession, or at least an explanation from the perspective of those who had lived through it. But confession or not, the case remained officially unsolved. Catherine Ashford was never found, never apprehended, never brought to trial. Whether she made it to New York or somewhere else, whether she lived out her life under an assumed name or ended it in despair, no one ever knew. Her house on Trad Street in Charleston was eventually sold to settle debts. Her belongings were dispersed. Her name faded from memory, except as a footnote in the darker corners of low country history. The Bellwood case became one of those stories that circulated in whispers for a generation, growing more lurid with each retelling, accumulating details that may or may not have been true. Some versions claimed the women had been discovered in a compromising embrace, which was false. Some said Catherine had been seen years later in San Francisco, living openly with another woman, which was unverifiable. Some insisted Marguerite had faked her death, and both women had fled together to Europe, which contradicted all physical evidence. The truth, as is often the case with stories that touch on subjects society prefers not to examine, became obscured beneath layers of embellishment, moral judgment, and willful forgetting. What remained as fact, stripped of speculation and sensation, was this. In June 1858, two women found themselves in an impossible situation, bound by feelings their world condemned, facing futures that offered them no path forward together. One died in a bedroom at Bellwood Plantation, likely by her own choice, ending a life that had become unbearable. The other fled into obscurity, carrying whatever grief and guilt and memories accompanied her into an unknown future. Neither woman's story was unique in the fundamental anguish it represented, though the dramatic circumstances of its ending were unusual. Throughout the antebellum South, and indeed throughout America in that era, countless women navigated the narrow spaces society allowed them, forming deep friendships that sometimes became something more, living parallel lives of public propriety and private feeling. Most of these relationships left no historical trace, conducted in such secrecy that they vanished entirely upon the deaths of those involved. The Bellwood case survives only because it ended in tragedy dramatic enough to generate investigation and documentation, pulling into public view a private world that usually remained invisible. The enslaved people of Bellwood, those who had witnessed pieces of the story and understood more than the white authorities realized, carried their own version of events into the turbulent years ahead. When the Civil War came 3 years later, and the plantation system that had defined low country life for generations collapsed, the stories of the old days were preserved in oral traditions passed among the freed people and their descendants. In these versions, told around fires and at family gatherings, the story of the two white ladies who loved each other and died for it became a kind of parable. A reminder that the big house held secrets and sorrows, just as the quarters did. That privilege did not shield anyone from the fundamental pains of being human, that everyone, regardless of station, was trapped in some way by the rigid social order of the antebellum South. For the white families of the Low Country, the Bellwood case was something to be forgotten as quickly as possible, a stain on the genteel image they cultivated. In the decades after the war, when the Lost Cause mythology transformed the antebellum South into a romanticized paradise of gracious living and contented slaves, stories like the Bellwood case had no place. The official histories mentioned Marguerite Bellwood not at all, or noted only that she died young and childless, and the circumstances were not discussed in polite company. Catherine Ashford's name disappeared entirely from the historical record, as if she had never existed. But the case file remained, yellowing in the Dorchester County Courthouse, a collection of witness statements and physicians' reports and letters and photographs that told a story the county preferred to forget. In 1865, during the chaotic final days of the war, when Sherman's army was marching through South Carolina, leaving destruction in its wake, the courthouse was burned. Most of the county records were destroyed, including the complete file on the Bellwood case. What survived were fragments. A few newspaper clippings from 1858 that mentioned the mysterious death without naming names, the burial record for Marguerite Bellwood with its vague notation, and the memories of a few old people who had been young when the events occurred. By the early 20th century, even these fragments were nearly forgotten. The great plantations of the Low Country had been broken up or fallen into decay. The families that had once defined the region's aristocracy had scattered or diminished in fortune. The world that had produced women like Marguerite and Catherine, with its rigid gender expectations and suffocating social conventions, had evolved into something different, though perhaps not as different as those living through the new century might have believed. In 1922, a graduate student at the College of Charleston named Eleanor Morrison was researching the social history of antebellum plantation widows for her thesis. She came across a brief mention of the Bellwood case in an 1858 Charleston newspaper, just a few lines noting that a plantation owner named Marguerite Bellwood had died under mysterious circumstances and an investigation was ongoing. Intrigued, Morrison attempted to find more information. The courthouse records were gone, but she managed to locate a few surviving documents. The burial record, a property deed showing the sale of Bellwood Plantation in 1859, and most importantly, a letter in the archives of a Charleston family that had been acquainted with the Bellwoods. The letter had been written by a woman named Abigail Thornton, wife of Colonel William Thornton, who had testified about seeing the carriage on the evening of June 10th. Abigail had written to her sister in Virginia in July 1858, gossiping about the scandal at Bellwood. The letter was remarkably frank by the standards of the time, stating plainly that Mrs. Bellwood and her friend from Charleston were discovered to have shared an unnatural affection, and one or both took their own lives rather than face the disgrace of exposure. The details are too indelicate to relate fully, but it is said the women were found together in circumstances that left no doubt as to the nature of their transgression. Colonel Thornton says the authorities wish to hush the matter up, as such things reflect badly on all respectable families of the region. I did not. This letter gave Morrison the context she needed to understand what had happened at Bellwood, though many details remained unclear. She included a brief discussion of the case in her thesis, noting it as an example of how plantation widows sometimes formed close relationships with other women that could transgress the boundaries of conventional friendship. Her thesis was filed in the college library, where it gathered dust for decades, read by perhaps a dozen scholars over the following years, none of whom pursued the Bellwood case further. The story might have ended there, lost in the obscurity of academic archives, except that in 1978, a researcher named Dr. Patricia Hammond was studying LGBTQ history in the American South. She was specifically looking for documented cases of same-sex relationships in the 19th century, trying to recover stories that had been deliberately erased or coded in language so euphemistic that later generations missed their significance. Hammond came across Morrison's thesis and recognized the Bellwood case as potentially significant. She began a more thorough investigation, tracking down every scrap of documentation she could find. Hammond's research took her to county archives, historical societies, private family collections, and the records of churches and cemeteries. She found the property records for both Bellwood Plantation and Catherine Ashford's Charleston house. She located a few surviving letters between Marguerite and Catherine in a collection that had been donated to a historical society by a descendant who had no idea of their significance. She found mentions of both women in various Charleston society registers and church records. She interviewed elderly residents of the Low Country, whose grandparents had known some of the people involved, though the memories handed down through 4 generations were vague and contradictory. What emerged from Hammond's research was a more complete picture of the 2 women and their relationship. Marguerite and Catherine had known each other since childhood, both having attended the same Charleston Academy for young ladies. They had been separated when Catherine married and moved to Philadelphia, but had maintained a correspondence. When Catherine returned to Charleston as a widow in 1856, the friendship had renewed and deepened into something more intimate. The 2 women had been extraordinarily careful to maintain appearances, meeting only occasionally in public and always with propriety, while conducting a secret correspondence and arranging private meetings away from scrutinizing eyes. Hammond argued in her 1983 book, Hidden Lives: Women's Relationships in the Antebellum South, that the Bellwood case represented not an isolated incident, but one example of a phenomenon that was far more common than historical records suggested. Same-sex relationships between women in the 19th century were often dismissed as romantic friendships by contemporary observers and later historians, the physical and emotional intensity explained away as a product of Victorian sentimentality. But Hammond marshaled evidence that many of these relationships were, in fact, what would now be understood as lesbian relationships, conducted under the cover of acceptable female friendship. The Bellwood case was particularly valuable to Hammond's research because the tragic ending had generated documentation that survived when most such relationships left no historical trace. The letters between Marguerite and Catherine, the journal entries, the witness testimony about their meetings in Charleston, all provided evidence of a relationship that was both deeply emotional and carefully hidden. Hammond argued that the desperation that led to the suicide pact was produced not by the relationship itself, but by the impossibility of living openly, the constant strain of concealment, the awareness that discovery would mean social death, even if it did not mean literal death. Hammond's book brought the Bellwood case back into public consciousness, at least within academic circles and among those interested in LGBTQ history. Marguerite Bellwood and Catherine Ashford were reclaimed as historical figures who deserved recognition, their story reinterpreted as one of love and tragedy rather than scandal and perversion. The case was included in subsequent histories of LGBTQ life in America, cited as an example of the harsh realities faced by same-sex couples before the modern era of greater acceptance and legal recognition. In 1995, a historical marker was placed near the site where Bellwood Plantation once stood, though the original house had long since burned down and the land was now divided among several owners. The marker made no specific mention of the circumstances of Marguerite's death, noting only that she had been a plantation owner who managed her estate during the final years before the Civil War. Local LGBTQ organizations pushed for a more explicit acknowledgement of the true story. But opposition from some residents and historical societies kept the marker's language vague and sanitized. The site of Catherine Ashford's house on Trad Street in Charleston still stands, now owned by a family with no connection to the Ashfords and no knowledge of the house's history. A small brass plaque by the door identifies it as a structure of historical significance, built in 1803, one of Charleston's well-preserved examples of single-house architecture. There is no mention of Catherine Ashford or what happened in June 1858. The cemetery where Marguerite Bellwood is buried has fared less well. The family plot was located on land that was sold multiple times after the Civil War, eventually becoming part of a commercial property. In the 1950s, when the land was developed for a shopping center, the remains in the family plot were supposed to be relocated to a public cemetery, but the process was handled carelessly. Some graves were moved, others were not, and records were incomplete. It is uncertain whether Marguerite's remains were actually moved or whether they still lie beneath the parking lot of a discount store, her final resting place, as forgotten as her story was for so many decades. This is perhaps a fitting metaphor for how history treats those who lived outside conventional boundaries. The physical traces disappear, the documents are destroyed or lost, the memories fade, and the people themselves are erased from the historical record except as cautionary tales or scandalous footnotes. It requires deliberate effort by later generations to recover these stories, to insist that these lives mattered, to resist the erasure that powerful social forces have always deployed against those who challenge norms. The truth of what happened in that bedroom at Bellwood Plantation in June 1858 will never be fully known. The two people who knew it completely are long dead. One buried in an uncertain grave, the other disappeared into obscurity. The documents that survived are fragmentary and filtered through the perspectives of investigators and witnesses who understood little of what they were seeing. The story has been shaped and reshaped by successive generations, each interpreting it through the lens of their own time's understanding of gender, sexuality, love, and death. But certain facts stand clear enough. Two women who loved each other in a world that gave them no space for that love found themselves facing an impossible choice. They chose death, or at least one of them chose death, while the other was willing to participate in that choice, or witness it. The aftermath left questions that have never been fully answered, mysteries that persist across a century and a half. Did they plan it together? Did one convince the other? Did Catherine survive by chance or by design? Why did she flee rather than face the consequences? Where did she go? How did she live with what happened? Did she regret her survival or embrace it as a chance for a life free from the pretense that had trapped her at Bellwood? These questions echo across the years, unanswerable but haunting. Reminders that behind the grand narratives of history, the wars and politics and economic forces, are individual human stories of people trying to navigate the particular circumstances of their lives, trying to find meaning and connection and authenticity in a world that often offered them none of these things. The magnolia trees that once lined the drive to Bellwood Plantation are long gone, cut down or died of old age or destroyed when the land was cleared for other uses. But magnolias still grow throughout the Low Country, their white blooms appearing each June, as they did in 1858, beautiful and fragrant for a brief time before the heat turns the petals brown and they fall to the ground and decay. It is an apt image for the story of Marguerite Bellwood and Catherine Ashford. Something beautiful that bloomed in secret, survived briefly under impossible conditions, and then was destroyed by forces it could not withstand, leaving behind only fragments and questions and the faintest trace of perfume in the air. In the end, what remains is a story about the cost of living authentically in a society that demands conformity. about the desperation that comes from having to choose between truth and survival, about the love that exists outside the boundaries society has drawn around acceptable human connection. It is a story that resonates not because it is unique, but because it is representative. One example among countless others of people who lived and loved and died in the margins, whose stories were deliberately erased, but who deserve to be remembered, who deserve to have their humanity acknowledged, even when their choices cannot be fully understood by those who did not face their particular impossibilities. The bedroom at Bellwood, where Marguerite died, no longer exists, burned down decades ago, along with the house that contained it. But if you stand on the land where Bellwood once stood, in the muggy heat of a South Carolina June, you can imagine what it might have been like. The closed room with its drawn curtains, the two women together in the privacy they could never have in the public world. The whispered conversations about futures that could not be, the growing awareness that their choices were narrowing to a single unbearable option, the moment when one or both decided that death was preferable to the half-life they were being forced to live. And then the aftermath, the locked door, the discovery, the investigation that exposed what was meant to be hidden, the scandal that confirmed all the worst fears that had driven them to such extremity. It is a tragedy in the classical sense, a story where character and circumstance combine to produce an outcome that seems both inevitable and unbearable. The tragedy lies not in the choices the women made, but in the fact that those choices were presented to them in the first place. In a society so rigid and unforgiving that two people who loved each other saw no option but death or flight, in a world so hostile to their very existence that one of them took poison and the other disappeared forever, rather than face the consequences of being who they actually were. Sheriff Coleman Breckinridge died in 1874, 16 years after the Bellwood case, having served as sheriff through the Civil War and the chaotic Reconstruction period that followed. In all those years of investigating crimes and dispensing justice, he maintained that the Bellwood case was the one that haunted him most, not because of any spectacular violence or dramatic villainy, but because he had come to understand, however imperfectly, that what had happened there was not really a crime in the conventional sense. It was a tragedy produced by the cruelty of social conventions that left certain people with no good options. In his final years, when age and illness had made him reflective, he reportedly told his daughter that if he could undo one decision from his career, it would be pushing the Bellwood investigation as hard as he did, exposing what might have been better left buried, causing pain to people who had suffered enough. His daughter, scandalized by this admission, insisted he had only done his duty. He agreed, but duty, he said, was sometimes the enemy of mercy. Dr. Marcus Waverly, the physician who examined the body and tried to determine cause of death, lived until 1881. He maintained a medical practice in the Low Country through the war years and the difficult period that followed. In his private papers, found after his death, was a notation about the Bellwood case that read, "Examined remains of woman who chose poison over dishonor, accompanied in her choice by one who loved her beyond the boundaries society permits. Cause of death: opium intoxication. True cause: a world too narrow for the fullness of human feeling. May God be more merciful in judgment than man has been." Samuel Pritchard, the overseer who discovered the locked room and climbed the ladder to the balcony, survived the war and eventually left plantation work entirely, becoming a schoolteacher in Georgia. He never married. In a letter to a friend written in 1890, he made a cryptic reference to the Bellwood case. "I learned that summer that not all monsters have teeth and claws. Some wear respectability like a mask and crush people under the weight of their expectations. And I learned that sometimes what looks like crime is actually courage, the courage to refuse a life that denies your deepest truths. I was too young then to understand this fully. Now I am old enough to know that the woman who fled Bellwood was not running from justice, but toward the only freedom she could imagine, and I hope she found it." Violet, Marguerite's maid, who identified the body by its scar, was freed when the war ended and remained in the Low Country, working as a seamstress and laundress. She rarely spoke of her time at Bellwood, but in the 1890s, she was interviewed by a journalist writing about the antebellum period. Asked about Marguerite Bellwood, Violet said, "She was a kind mistress, as such things went, though kindness within a cruel system is still complicity with cruelty. But in her personal life, she struggled like anyone else, maybe more because she could not be who she truly was." The white folks thought the tragedy was that she died in sin. The real tragedy was that she could not live in truth. She and that other lady, they loved each other. I knew it. We all knew it in the quarters. We understood things the white folks refused to see. And when she died, I felt sorrow not for her sin, but for a world so hard it would not let her simply love who she loved. We were enslaved in body, but she was enslaved in a different way, by expectations and conventions. Both kinds of chains destroy people, just in different ways. These fragments of testimony from those who witnessed or participated in the Bellwood case suggest that even in 1858, some people understood what was happening with more compassion and insight than the official investigation managed. The tragedy of Marguerite and Catherine was visible to those who chose to see it, though most preferred to look away, to judge, to condemn what they would not try to understand. And Catherine herself, the woman who survived, who fled, who disappeared into the vast anonymous spaces of 19th century America. Her fate remains unknown. Perhaps she made it to New York and built a new life under a different name. Perhaps she found other women who understood her experiences and formed a community in the hidden corners of urban life, where such communities existed even then. Perhaps she lived decades longer, carrying the memory of that June morning when she left Marguerite's body behind and walked away from the only world she had ever known. Perhaps she thrived in her new freedom, or perhaps she was crushed by guilt and grief. Perhaps she died alone and forgotten, or perhaps she found love again with someone who could share openly what she and Marguerite had been forced to hide. Or perhaps the darker possibilities are true. Perhaps she never made it out of South Carolina. Perhaps she took her own life in the weeks after fleeing Bellwood, unable to bear the weight of survival. Perhaps she was caught and jailed under a false name for some minor offense and died unknown in custody. Perhaps she succumbed to disease or accident in her flight, her body buried in an unmarked grave, her identity lost forever. The complete lack of any verified sighting after the initial weeks suggests she was either extraordinarily successful in evading detection or did not survive long enough to leave a trace. The most romantic interpretation, the one that those who wish her story to have a happier ending prefer to believe, is that she made it somewhere far from South Carolina and lived out her days in relative peace, the grief and trauma of Bellwood eventually softening into bittersweet memory, the fear of discovery gradually fading as years passed and no one came looking. In this version, Catherine becomes one of those 19th century women who successfully reinvented themselves, who created new identities in places where no one knew their histories, who found ways to build meaningful lives despite devastating loss. It is a hopeful interpretation, though unsupported by evidence. A story told because we need some stories to end with survival rather than complete destruction. But history deals in facts, and the fact is that Catherine Ashford vanished and was never heard from again, and Marguerite Bellwood died in her bed at Bellwood Plantation in June 1858, and the precise truth of what passed between them in those final days will never be known with certainty. What can be known is that their story, recovered from the fragments of documentation that survived and the efforts of later researchers who refused to let it be forgotten, stands as testimony to lives lived at the margins, to love that existed outside acceptable boundaries, to the human cost of rigid social conventions, and to the particular suffering of those who could not be themselves in the world they inhabited. The story of the plantation widow who vanished and the body found in her bed is ultimately a story about erasure and recovery, about how certain lives are written out of history and how much effort it takes to write them back in, about the silences in the historical record and what those silences conceal, about the need to remember not just the famous and powerful, but also those who lived and died in obscurity, whose stories matter precisely because they reveal truths about the past that official histories prefer to ignore. It is a story that belongs to 1858, but also to every era since, including our own, because the fundamental questions it raises about authenticity and conformity, about love and social acceptance, about the courage required to live truthfully in a hostile world, remain relevant across time. The specific circumstances have changed. The legal and social penalties for certain kinds of love have lessened in many places, but the underlying tension between individual truth and social expectation persists, and people still make agonizing choices about how much of themselves to reveal and how much to hide. And so the magnolia trees bloom each June in the low country as they always have, beautiful and ephemeral, and somewhere in the soil beneath the shopping centers and subdivisions that now cover the landscape lie the unmarked graves of those who lived and died in that vanished world, and their stories float like whispers through the humid air, asking to be remembered, insisting that they mattered, demanding that we acknowledge the fullness of their humanity even when we cannot fully comprehend their choices. This is what history owes to the forgotten. Not judgment, but remembrance, not condemnation, but the effort to understand, not erasure, but the insistence that every life contains complexity and dignity, regardless of how well it conformed to its era's expectations. Marguerite Bellwood and Catherine Ashford deserve nothing less.